On a cold January morning in 1661, a bloodthirsty crowd gathered in the streets of London. The people awaited the most macabre and symbolic spectacle in English history, the posthumous execution of Oliver Cromwell, the man who had overthrown the monarchy and executed a king. By express order of the new monarch, Charles II, Cromwell's corpse, dead of natural causes 2 years earlier, was exhumed from his grave in Westminster Abbey. At midday, the decaying body was dragged through the streets in a filthy cloth that served as a shroud and hung on a gibbet at Tyburn, the traditional site of executions. After being displayed 4 hours for the crowd to gawk at, the corpse was beheaded, its head impaled on a 6 meters high stake and exhibited atop Westminster Hall. More shockingly, his testicles were publicly removed, displayed as a final symbol of the emasculation of the power that had dared to challenge the crown. That mutilated body, exposed to the elements, would remain there for over 20 years, a reminder to anyone who might consider defying royal authority. How did a monarch known as the Merry King, lover of parties, women, and the arts, become such a ruthless avenger? To understand this grotesque episode in British history, we must go back to the beginning of Charles II's tumultuous life, and the events that shaped his reign of vengeance and restoration. Charles Stuart was born on May 29, 1630, the son of King Charles I of England and Queen Henrietta Maria of France. As the eldest son and heir to the throne, the young prince was raised amid the luxury and ceremony of the Stuart court, trained to assume the divine power he believed was his birthright. But the world he was meant to inherit was crumbling beneath his family's feet. Charles I firmly believed in the divine right of kings, the notion that monarchs were chosen by God and answered only to him. This view put him on a collision course with the rising power of Parliament. As young Charles watched, political and religious tensions boiled over into the English Civil War in 1642, when he was just 12 years old. The conflict split the country between Cavaliers and Roundheads. The war was brutal and transformative, destroying the social order that had supported the monarchy for centuries. Charles, still a teenager, was more than just a witness. In 1645, at age 15, he was appointed commander of royalist forces in Western England, a staggering responsibility for someone so young. The royalist defeat in 1646 forced the young prince into exile. From afar, he was horrified as he watched the event that would forever change his worldview and fuel his hatred for his enemies. On January 30, 1649, his father, King Charles I, was publicly executed in London after an unprecedented trial, accused of treason against his own kingdom. The execution of Charles I left a deep mark on the young prince. Upon receiving the news, he tore his clothes and swore vengeance. At just 18, Charles II proclaimed himself king, but he was a monarch without a kingdom, forced to wander the courts of Europe, dependent on the charity of relatives and allies. Often sleeping in borrowed palaces and living with scarce resources, it was a constant humiliation for someone born to rule the British Empire. Meanwhile, in England, Oliver Cromwell consolidated power as Lord Protector, effectively a military dictator ruling with an iron fist under the guise of a commonwealth. A devout Puritan, Cromwell transformed England into a quasi-theocratic state, where festivities were banned, theatres closed, and harsh morality imposed. For 11 long years, Charles plotted his return, skillfully navigating the treacherous waters of European politics. In 1651, he even tried to reclaim his throne by force, leading a Scottish army against Cromwell, but he was decisively defeated at the Battle of Worcester. What followed was an extraordinary escape. With a bounty on his head equivalent to millions of dollars today, the young king fled through occupied England for 6 weeks. In one legendary episode, he hid in the branches of an oak tree, while Cromwell's soldiers searched directly beneath him. This royal oak became a powerful symbol of his survival and resilience. assisted by a network of loyalists willing to risk everything. Charles eventually escaped to France, disguised as a servant, a humiliating experience for a king. The years in exile shaped the future monarch. While moving through France, Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands, Charles learned valuable lessons in political survival. He developed legendary charm, a talent for reading people, and a pragmatic flexibility that sharply contrasted with his father's rigid ideology. Where Charles I had been unyielding, Charles II learned to bend without breaking. More importantly, he developed an insatiable thirst for vengeance against those who had destroyed his family and stolen his birthright. Even in exile, Charles led a notoriously libertine life. His many lovers and extravagant parties, often funded with borrowed money, scandalized even the French aristocracy. But this libertine image hid a deeply determined man who never lost sight of his ultimate goal, the restoration of the Stuart throne. That opportunity finally came with Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658. Cromwell's son Richard lacked his father's charisma and military skill, and soon failed to maintain control over the army and government. Within 2 years, the Republican regime was collapsing in factional disputes. Sensing the power vacuum, General George Monk, commander of English forces in Scotland, marched on London and forced the calling of a new parliament. This convention parliament, recognizing the inevitability of monarchical restoration to avoid civil chaos, entered secret negotiations with the exiled Charles. In April 1660, Charles issued the Declaration of Breda, an astutely crafted document promising amnesty to his former enemies, religious tolerance, back pay for the army, and land disputes to be settled by Parliament. It was a diplomatic masterpiece, offering something for every major faction without truly compromising his future power. On May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles returned triumphantly to London, welcomed by ecstatic crowds. One contemporary observer wrote that the streets were paved with people. Another noted the king was nearly crushed by the love of his people. For a nation weary from civil war and Puritan austerity, the return of the merry monarch promised stability and joy. But behind the charming smile and promises of reconciliation, Charles harbored dark plans for retribution. The apparent clemency of the Declaration of Breda had been calculated to ensure a peaceful return to power. Once secure on the throne, the true scale of his vengeance became clear. The first targets were obvious: the regicides, those who had signed his father's death warrant. Despite vague promises of amnesty, Charles made it clear that forgiveness would not extend to them. Of the 59 men who signed the death warrant, many were already dead or had fled abroad. Of those remaining, 30 were condemned to death in a calculated mix of revenge and political pragmatism. Charles allowed 10 to be executed publicly as examples, while others were sentenced to life in prison. The executions followed the full traitor's ritual: hanged but cut down alive, their entrails removed and burned before their dying eyes, followed by beheading. These gruesome public spectacles drew massive crowds eager to see the fate of those who had dared to raise a hand against their sovereign. But the most symbolic and macabre revenge was reserved for the already dead. Oliver Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw were all long dead, but that did not shield them from royal wrath. On January 30, 1661, the anniversary of Charles I's execution, their corpses were exhumed and subjected to posthumous execution. Cromwell's genital mutilation symbolized the emasculation of the power that had defied monarchy. It revealed the depth of trauma and humiliation Charles had endured during his exile. It wasn't enough that his enemies were dead. Their corpses had to be violated, their posthumous dignity destroyed, and their remains displayed as warnings to future generations. Cromwell's head remained impaled atop Westminster Hall until around 1685, when a storm brought it down. Its subsequent whereabouts became the subject of macabre fascination. passing among private collectors until it was finally buried in the 20th century at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, in a secret ceremony. As Charles's vengeance unfolded, he also moved swiftly to consolidate power and reimagine the English monarchy. The Cavalier Parliament, elected in 1661, was dominated by fervent royalists eager to restore royal prerogatives. A series of laws, known as the Clarendon Code, established a rigid Anglican church and persecuted religious dissenters, especially the Puritans associated with Cromwell. Charles's revenge wasn't limited to politics or religion. Personally, the restored monarch was a study in contrasts. Publicly, he cultivated an image of indulgence, reintroducing pleasures suppressed during the Protectorate. Theatres reopened, festivals returned, and the court became notorious for its hedonism. Behind that facade, however, Charles was a tireless worker and shrewd politician who never forgot the lessons of exile. His return marked not just the restoration of monarchy, but the reinvention of his own image. Where his father had been formal and aloof, Charles II was casual, often strolling through St. James's Park, accompanied only by his spaniels, dogs that still bear his name. Where Charles I had been famously sober, his son flaunted a court of mistresses. He acknowledged 14 illegitimate children by various women, including actresses, courtesans, and even an orange seller who became a royal mistress. This apparent frivolity masked a fierce determination, never to endure exile and humiliation again. "I do not intend to go on my travels again," he often told advisors who urged him to take politically risky positions. Charles knew his survival depended on balancing competing interests while gradually strengthening the crown. He faced extraordinary challenges. The Great Plague of 1665 killed nearly a quarter of London's population. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed much of the capital. His response to these crises, remaining in London during the plague and personally overseeing firefighting efforts, increased his popularity and cemented his image as a king who, unlike his father, truly cared for his people. Nothing tested his grip on the throne more than the rising anti-Catholic paranoia. His brother, James, Duke of York, converted to Catholicism. Charles himself, who would secretly convert on his deathbed, was suspected of harboring Catholic sympathies. The 1678 Popish Plot, a fabricated Catholic conspiracy to assassinate the king, sparked mass hysteria. Charles responded with political pragmatism, publicly allowing the execution of innocent Catholics to appease public anger while secretly protecting others, including his brother. In 1681, when Parliament tried to exclude the Catholic Duke of York from the line of succession, Charles used cunning maneuvering and demonstrations of power to defeat the exclusion bill. He dissolved 3 successive parliaments, invoked royal prerogative to bypass opposition, and ultimately triumphed, emerging stronger than ever. For the last years of his reign, Charles ruled without calling Parliament, financed by secret subsidies from France's King Louis XIV. The cost of this support was a pro-French foreign policy and tacit Catholic tolerance. Concessions Charles was willing to make to ensure domestic autonomy. The dual nature of his reign, public festivities, private calculation, apparent mercy, selective revenge, confused his contemporaries and continues to puzzle historians. He was a monarch who ordered brutal executions, but also impressed contemporaries like John Evelyn, who said he had such a gentle, familiar nature as no prince ever had. Charles's reign, often called the Restoration, was also a restoration of his own dignity. The humiliations of youth seeing his father executed, living on foreign charity, hiding from pursuers left scars that he hid behind smiles and jokes. His brutal revenge against Cromwell and the Regicides reveals how deep those wounds were. Charles's vengeance didn't end with executions and exhumations. Throughout his reign, he systematically dismantled Cromwell's legacy, abolishing republican institutions and restoring royal pomp and ceremony. Even architecture reflected this agenda. The rebuilding of Whitehall Palace and Windsor Castle aimed to emphasize royal majesty and erase memories of the Puritan interregnum. Charles himself became a political symbol. Where Cromwell had been austere in armor, Charles projected royal grandeur. Standing over 6 feet tall with dark skin that earned him the nickname Black Boy, wearing elaborate wigs that enhanced his regal presence, his portraits, painted by artists like Sir Peter Lely, show him in classical armor or sumptuous robes, embodying the divine authority his father had died for. In his final years, despite growing health problems, Charles maintained a strict routine, rising at 5 a.m. to handle state affairs before the court awoke. Interested in science, he founded the Royal Observatory at Greenwich and patronized the Royal Society, showing an intellect often underestimated by his peers. As the Earl of Halifax observed, he had a pleasantness in his constitution that made way to many errors, but this very easiness prevented their consequences. Death came for Charles in February 1685 after a sudden illness, likely uremia. He suffered for nearly a week before dying. On his deathbed came the final revelation. Charles II, the defender of Anglicanism, secretly converted to Catholicism, receiving last rites from a hidden priest, a fittingly paradoxical ending for a man whose reign was full of contradictions. The king who ordered brutal executions was also known for mercy, often commuting death sentences. The monarch who persecuted Puritans also privately advocated for religious tolerance. The libertine whose court scandalized moralists was also a diligent administrator who rebuilt his nation after disaster. His last words to his brother included a plea, "Let not poor Nelly starve," referring to his beloved mistress Nelgwyn. That concern for those close to him, even in his final moments, says much about the enigma of Charles II, a man capable of both brutal vengeance and genuine compassion. On his tomb in Westminster Abbey, no mention is made of the darkest part of his reign, the gruesome revenge against Cromwell's remains. The official story prefers to remember the merry monarch, the king who brought stability after decades of chaos, who rebuilt London after the Great Fire, who patronized the arts and sciences, who steered Stuart politics through treacherous waters. But that sanitized version hides a more complex truth. Charles too was shaped by trauma and humiliation. His revenge against Cromwell, just executing living supporters, but defiling their corpses, reveals a man determined to exorcise the demons of his past. The symbolic emasculation of Cromwell's corpse was a graphic assertion that royal power had not only returned, but was potent and unchallengeable. The legacy of Charles II remains as contradictory as the man himself. He restored the monarchy, but in a modified form that acknowledged Parliament's role. He oversaw brutal executions, but also extinguished the final embers of Europe's religious wars. He established a model of kingship based on personal charisma and connection with ordinary subjects, moving away from the distant divine right that had doomed his father. Perhaps the real meaning of Charles's revenge is this: it marked the final end of one era and the beginning of another. The Regicide's executions were the last acts of a horrific civil war. The defilement of Cromwell's corpse was the final rejection of the Republican experiment. From that point forward, England followed a different path, not the autocracy Charles I had defended, nor the republic Cromwell imposed, but a new kind of constitutional monarchy that, in modified form, survives to this day. The king who ordered his dead enemies' testicles cut off in public was not just a petty avenger, but a man determined to ensure the monarchy's humiliation would never be repeated. His vengeance was not only personal, it was institutional, a bloody repudiation of any challenge to royal authority. In the end, Charles II succeeded where his father had failed. He didn't just survive, he transformed the monarchy into something capable of surviving in a new age of parliamentary power. And the cost of that transformation, including Cromwell's mutilated corpse, reveals the human toll of the political upheavals that shaped modern England and the complex, contradictory man at the heart of this drama.